All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Albertson. I am the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to join us. I know it's a busy week here before the holidays. I appreciate everybody taking time out of your schedule to listen. Today's CGSR lecture series is going to be a talk by Jimmy Goodrich, who is a senior fellow at the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, and his talk today is titled The Dawn of Big Science in China. For those of you who tune in these lectures pretty regularly, there's often a lot of book recommendations. This term big science, which Jimmy's going to talk about in his presentation, there's actually a book called Big Science, Ernst Lawrence and the Invention that launched the military-industrial complex by an author named Michael Hiltsack, and I'll put it in the chat for you. But this term big science is very foundational to what we do here at Lawrence Livermore, how E.O. Lawrence thought about science. But as Jimmy's going to talk about in his talk, very emblematic also in what China is doing in their program, a very sort of government industrial based approach to scientific development, including the construction of big, large facilities, which he's going to talk about. We have done a lot of lectures at CGSR on technology competition over the years, with some of the leading lights in the field, of which Jimmy is one. If you want to go back through our catalog, you can see presentations of people like Chris Miller, his book Chip Wars, by Jeffrey Ding on his book on technology competition. CGSR, we just did a publication called In Search of Strategic Advantage, Understanding the Landscape of Technology Competition. There's a lot of focus right now on this idea of technology competition, which means you have to look at not just what we're doing at the lab in the broader sort of US ecosystem with things like the Genesis project, which was launched a couple weeks ago, but you also then have to look at what the other side's doing. And then you have to do a sort of assessment of, are we ahead? Are we behind? How's the other side catch up? What should we spend money on? What is strategic advantage in this field? What does it mean? So there's a lot of research that can be done here. There's a lot of work that can be done here. There's a lot of thinking that can be done here. And so it's fabulous to have Jimmy with us here today for his talk. Let me just say a little bit about him. If you Google his name, you can easily see that he is a leading expert in this field on sort of technology, geopolitics, and national security. His main focus is on China and East Asia. He is a senior advisor for technology analysis at the RAND Corporation. He's a non-resident fellow, as I said, at the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, and his work mainly deals with China, technology, and national competitiveness, which is the focus of his talk today. For those of you sort of new to CGSR lectures, the way this is going to work is the speaker's going to talk for 30 to 45 minutes. He's going to present some slides. At any point in the conversation, feel free to use the little button at the bottom to raise your hand electronically. Feel free to type in the chat if you have questions for the speaker. As soon as they conclude their remarks, I'd like to get the discussion going as quickly as possible. So once they conclude their remarks, have those questions ready, have your hands up, and then we'll jump right into the discussion. So Jimmy, thank you for being with us today in person on site and here virtually to do a talk, and over to you for your comments.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for the generous and kind introduction. And I was telling Michael this morning, I'm actually out here in Livermore. I know this is a cold day for you, the coldest day of the year, but it's 20 degrees in Washington. So it's really nice to be somewhere warmer than the bone chilly confines of the East Coast. As Michael mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the rise of what I call the dawn of big science in China. I'll talk about how big science has benefited the United States for our national innovation, for national security and economics, and why China has been envious and jealous of our successful system and is working very, very hard and aggressively to emulate it with more pronounced investments than ever, more determined central government support than ever, and also a sense of national mission, fundamentally a national mission that is driving China to become the world's preeminent scientific and technological superpower. They believe that is fundamentally essential to recognize the dream of China's great rejuvenation. And without a strong and world-leading science technology ecosystem, they believe their goals on the military modernization side, on their economic development side, even in social well-being, environment, health, and safety, is not possible without a incredibly strong and deep science technology base. And I'll talk about where some of those investments are being made, particularly now how across China, as their economy is slowing, how they're funding some of these investments, what they're prioritizing, and then what this might mean and for the future of U.S.-China competition, and also understand a little bit what are some of the speed bumps or challenges that China is facing in attempting to open up this new era of big science, whether it's from political ideology or economic growth constraints that might be a factor mitigating some of China's own ambitious goals. So I've put together a couple of slides here. This is based upon some research that I've been doing over the last 24 months, particularly with University of California, San Diego, the Institute on Global Cooperation and Conflict. Very thankful to the IGCC that's allowed me to really spend time thinking about China's rise as an S&T superpower. And I've been, by way of background, thinking about China's rise in the science technology ecosystem by way of my career over the last 20 years. I started out working in Beijing for a nonprofit and the U.S. Embassy, where some of my initial work in the early 2000s was visiting the China Academy of Sciences, visiting their science labs, a biotech facility, a particle accelerator. And, I can think back to the era then, which was the early 2000s, and today. And really, you have to marvel at the progress that China has made. And in some cases, be a bit jealous about the level of investment that they're willing to pour into these areas. Okay, so I'll open it up here with my talk. I call it the dawn of big science in China. And this is actually an image of the China Academy of Sciences High Energy Physics Institute in Hefei. This is their new BEST or CRAFT Nuclear Fusion Engineering Science Center. This is not a 3D mock-up. And actually, they've doubled the size of the facility just in the last 2 years. And so I think, one of the takeaways, hopefully, that you have from this is that China is moving fast, they're thinking bold, and they're investing big. And that's really the theme across all these investments that China is making. But stepping back, as your colleague mentioned, the era of big science in the United States, whether it's through the Cold War, through the present day, I think particularly to this audience is well understood. But when I go to talk to policymakers or other groups that aren't as steeped in scientific knowledge and our national lab and innovation ecosystem, I like to use this as a bit of a backdrop. Thinking about these large efforts driven by Cold War interests, we had fewer amount engagements on the international collaboration side. Whether it's the first cyclotron or even Alvin Weinberg, a towering figure in Oak Ridge Lab, he coined the term the big science, for example, in the 1960s. And this is really then what built out our national lab ecosystem today. That's spilled off into commercial startups, venture capital companies who have been able to partner with the lab and build fantastic innovations that have advanced both humanities technology base, but also our own national security. And thinking about today, we're still doing big science, but with a fewer number of facilities being approved and constructed. Funding obviously is subject to politics and takes a little bit longer. There's more international collaboration on the positive side, whether it's CERN, for example, or the James Webb Telescope. But overall, the pace has slowed in the U.S. And in some Western countries, and investment into big science facilities. And overall, the environmental regulatory concerns to the safety and other means has created certainly a different environment that existed sort of in the heyday of big science in the U.S. Throughout the Cold War. And why does this matter? I like to use this slide to really provide an example of how today's bleeding edge commercial innovation has benefited from an era of big science. For example, on the right is the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturing photolithography machine. By way of background, I spent 10 years in the semiconductor industry and worked closely with many of these companies. And the level of engineering and science that went into the creation of this machine is really outstanding. And much of it is a direct output of research that was funded in our national lab enterprise. For example, a lot of the early innovation that went into using extreme ultraviolet light and laser discharge plasma came from research that many of our national labs were doing. The first experimental EUV machine used the Berkeley light source, for example, to be able to image their first semiconductor patterns. A lot of the engineers, for example, used physics and shockwave propagation innovation and discovery that was done by our national labs in the 50s for nuclear weapons science, for modeling how molten tin would implode at 10,000 drops per second. Precision optics and glass, for example, that has been innovated over decades for laser ignition, is also being used in the semiconductor space. And of course, precision engineering, mechanotronics, a lot of that knowledge that's been gained through things like our space program has also been represented in the EUV machines that are incredibly lightweight, high strength metal alloys, moving at high speed and very, very high level of accuracy and calibration. And so if we think to today, why does this relate for China? On the right is the EUV machine, as I mentioned. Those are now export controlled and restricted for sale to China. And so China now faces the overwhelming challenge of not only trying to overcome those export controlled choke points, and they've struggled to do so over the last 5 years. They've not been able to reproduce an EUV machine that we know of since export controls were placed on them in 2000. They're working hard, but now I think China's shifting its understanding and realizing that without a strong research innovation base, without comparable national labs that are working across cutting edge scientific domains, they won't be able to just simply reinvent something that is the product of decades of that type of innovation. And so China is really launching now on this era of big science to help it both overcome technological barriers that have been put in place by the US and others as part of this great power competition, but also to push it towards the frontier of science. And China's rise, of course, as a scientific superpower has been relatively well documented, although not necessarily paid attention to enough. In fact, The Economist last year had a very good piece on the rise of Chinese science. And it looked at overall macro figures as to China's share of global high impact papers, their contributions to the top 100 papers in the Nature Index, and specific scientific disciplines, particularly material science, chemistry, engineering, even in physics. China has pulled ahead in terms of high impact, high quality paper as of 2022. And of course, on a talent output, China has been graduating a far higher number, an increasingly higher qualified or comparable qualified level of students in some of their domestic universities than the United States and the European Union. And so I think, China's rise, we're seeing this already, that output, particularly on the industrial side, whether it's in robotics with companies like Unitree, whether it's in battery technology and chemistry with companies like CATL, that is the world's leading EV battery company, or in manufacturing scale-up innovation with companies like BYD producing low-cost but very high-quality electric vehicles. But that's, relatively process-based innovation and manufacturing process-based innovation. What China is really attempting to do now is move towards fundamental scientific discovery that they believe will help fuel new applications throughout their economy and for their national security. This has really been underscored over the last 5 years. As you may be aware, the Communist Party in China, organized by its Central Committee and then the Politburo, every 5 years has a national party congress where they set the priorities for the nation and for the party. In 2020, at the last party congress, one of the most important developments was the elevation of science and technology from a civilian to a party affair. This also led to the creation of a new Central Science and Technology Commission that is now superseding and sits on top of all of the nation's whole of nation innovation system, as China calls it, including the military, state-owned enterprises, universities, national labs, local government. And this commission is now giving guidance and regularly coordinating national science technology policy. And this is important because the goal is strengthened party unified control. Xi Jinping believes that more patriotic scientists, more red-blooded scientists will be more productive for the nation. And it also reinforces the party's approach towards whole-of-nation mobilization, where much like how China addresses their innovation in aerospace, in their national space program, or, for example, in their Olympic medals program. It's a by any means possible, the end result only matters type of approach, where cost is really one of the less important metrics for decision making. And so this is actually quite unique to China. They call this whole of nation innovation system. Think big national efforts where you have a high degree of unity across government, maybe say for the Apollo program or the Manhattan Project. Those are the type of mobilization efforts that China looks to try and emulate. It's also much more secretive. In today's China, science technology is a more sensitive issue, as they seek to try and obfuscate their science technology advancements from foreign watch and awareness. And as a result, China does not publish the makeup of this commission. They don't make public any and all meetings that they hold, or really in much detail the directives or the policies and plans relating to long-range science technology development. This includes some of China's 5-year plans that they used to publish for science technology, for scientific infrastructure, or their medium long-range plan that's through 2035 are now classified or non-public documents, whereas all their previous editions of those policies were made public. This makes policy watching slightly more difficult, but it also makes it more interesting as China is bulking up its efforts in this space. And as they're trying to mobilize their nation and be secret, those two things are obviously in conflict with each other. And so there's some interesting parallels or different types of information that might still come out of the system that as China analysts, we watch closely. So for example, the new S&T Commission, we know through some local governments or different journals, has mentioned that they've been focused on deep earth and deep ocean exploration. They've been working to coordinate local government science technology programs to ensure that there's not overlap or duplicative investment that's being done by different cities. And so we've been able to glean some amounts of information from reading open source information in largely Chinese literature. But one of the biggest results of the party making science technology innovation a top priority has been in their own activity. In fact, if we assess all the different directives, guidance, and visits that China's top 25 political elite or their Politburo have taken, we see now virtually on every tour or visit that the central government makes in different provinces and cities includes now a must-have stop to a science lab, an engineering facility. And just in the last 2 years, we've seen China's leaders focus on lithography, low Earth orbit satellites, materials science, agricultural science, semiconductor manufacturing, robotics. And even in the most recent 5-year plan that is being drafted right now, and Xi Jinping gave some guidance remarks at Republic last month, he declared that China needs to take even more extraordinary measures to make breakthroughs in scientific domains, including semiconductors, robotics, advanced materials, machine tools, and software. And in the Chinese system, when they call for extraordinary measures, that means that the government needs to really think about their own KPIs and that their own political careers, that their own advancement as a mayor, as a provincial governor will now be measured against the hard metrics of seeing science in their respective jurisdiction improve. And so this is now a hard KPI also that the party within China is measuring the success of its own cadres by. And funding, of course, is increased to match the political ambitions that the party has placed for science, technology, innovation. On the left is a chart from the Special Competitive Studies Program. On the right is from Rodion Group. On the left, it shows how China's R&D intensity and basic research funding has increased, where basic research is increasing as an overall percentage of R&D. And the breakdown, increasingly you see the private sector within China, both state-owned enterprises and private companies, also expending a significant amount of funds on research, much like the United States. So it's no longer just the government as a driver, still a very large driver, but also you have the private sector within China that is increasingly dynamic and investing in basic research on their own. These funds and the overall macro data, though, they do miss some of the actual spending. Much of China's science, technology, research budgets that are disclosed generally lag by 18 to 24 months. And they generally do not include a lot of the local government budget lines that they might, for example, allocate for the construction of a new laser facility or a synchrotron light source. Some of the hints, though, that we can see that the numbers are much larger than what they disclose were made last year when China announced a new national infrastructure and critical security capability loan program that allocated $150 billion in extra long-term bonds and loans for major national projects, including science and technology infrastructure. And so as the central government sends out the signal for an increased investment, we're seeing their central finance institutions, the China Development Bank, explicitly allocate and earmark funding, loans, grants, equity infusions, specifically for example, national science labs, national science infrastructure, and new facilities. And so this sort of call and response, as we may have seen in the Chinese system, when previously it was for building roads and bridges, it's now being adjusted to build for, quote, new quality, high productive forces, to include science facilities across China. And the discussion of the role of national labs within China actually has been something that Xi Jinping has been focused on for quite some time. In 2015, over a decade ago, for example, Xi Jinping was quoted in Xinhua during a meeting with Chinese scientists and saying that national labs are a critical platform for major developed countries, aka the United States, and specifically citing Argonne, Los Alamos, Lawrence Berkeley as research bases that revolve around national missions that China needs to emulate. Historically, of course, China has focused a lot of its research budget within its existing China Academy of Sciences. They have over 100 different institutes. But that system, while it has seen some success, also has a number of drawbacks. It's largely based on the Soviet system. Many of the institutes are quite stovepiped. There's a lot of bureaucracy at the central CAS headquarters in Beijing. And there's a lot of politics involved, prioritizing which research institutes are going to get what type of funding. To overcome that, China in 2015 through 18 undertook a large amount of reform of its S&T ecosystem by increasing transparency in their science technology budgets, by requiring more accountability of the scientists who are principal investigators, and by establishing a whole set of what they call new type national labs to try and break through a lot of the existing challenges with their CAS system. CAS is still a priority. It's still receiving a lot of funding, but we're now seeing a almost equal amount of funding go to a number of institutes outside of CAS that are competitive to CAS. They're competing on an equal basis for grants and funding from a number of China's ministries and central government budgets. These are largely being set up in the provinces and the cities by entrepreneurial mayors, governors, who are looking at Xi Jinping's vision for the country and understanding how science is critical to that, and building domain-focused labs, in fact, over 100 new labs since 2018, focused on everything from small modular nuclear reactors to marine biology, to high-energy physics, to space exploration. These are domain-focused labs, much like, for example, an FFRDC like the Aerospace Corporation or the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, where they have a public-facing element, but they also work on classified government programs as well. And actually much is not known to the outside world about these new labs. Many of them have obscure names, but many of them are actually partnering closely with China's military research ecosystem, whether it's through the Seven Sons Defense Universities or the military itself. And in fact, many of them are partnering hand in hand with the government, military, and leading commercial companies like Alibaba and Huawei. And so they're trying to build, as China says, this new national team, new being bringing the old, the China Academy of Sciences, its universities, and the new with its private companies together to create this new network of new type of national labs. Beyond that, China has been making big strides in the actual big science, the large hundreds of millions or billion-dollar plus facilities in basic research that China hopes will help propel the nation forward towards the edge of innovation. And ultimately, one of the important goals for the party, and I think for Xi Jinping's legacy, is for finally, post-1949 or the establishment of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping's wish is for a Chinese-born, living in China, science conducted in China, Nobel Prize in Science be awarded to a Chinese scientist. That's been a large sort of point of dissatisfaction from China. And with these investments in these new facilities and new labs and new programs, China is increasingly optimistic and hopeful that they will not only contribute to ongoing global R&D efforts, but also on their own pioneer new domains. Some of the facilities that China has built over the last 10 years, but are relatively well known, include the world's deepest and largest underground laboratory for research of dark matter, a new underground neutrino lab in Guangzhou known as the Juno facility, and of course, the world's largest fast radio telescope for exploring the deep space is now operating in China. Of course, for China, everything does have a plan. And in fact, China has a 5-year plan for national science and technology facilities. This is the list of national science facilities that were outlined in China's previous 14 5-year plan. In fact, China's had a 5-year plan for national S&T infrastructure since 2013. They also have a long-range plan, a 10 to 15-year plan that supersedes and acts as a framework to the mini plans they release every 5 years. In the 13 5-year plan, China announced about the construction of about 5 or 7 new facilities. In the 12 5-year plan, it was about 5 or 7, and about the 13 5-year plan, they announced about a dozen. In the 14 5-year plan, they announced 20. The expectation is that the upcoming 15 5-year plan, China might even have a larger number of the new science technology facilities that will be announced for development and construction. Over the last 5 years, China's been very busy building new labs for pulse power, for Z-pinch, for human cell lineage science, for ultra-large deep engineering, earthquake simulation, for advanced air-breathing engine test facilities, for a large number of light sources. We'll talk a little bit about those that are being built. One of the drivers as well that we have to recall is that up until around 2018, China very much was a deep participant in the global science ecosystem, and that many of its leading scientists were accessing a number of the open public user facilities that were available in the United States and in Europe and Japan and other parts of developed economies. And if you looked at a lot of the science papers that were being published, many of China's leading scientists were using the Berkeley Light Source or working at CERN or ITER in France, and using that as a base for expanding their novel insights into the different scientific domains that they were working on. Since geopolitical tensions have increased, China's access to some, but not all of these facilities become more restricted. And that is a driver, I believe, that's accelerating China's development of their own indigenous alternatives to, for example, the advanced photon source in Argonne. China has now built the high energy photon source in Beijing. And so you see a lot of one-for-one matching of U.S. capability, but in many areas, China is also investing in capabilities that exceed our own, whether it's in Chongqing Super Transient Experimental Device or China's new National Enlishment Facility that have ambitions to be much larger, much more advanced, and working in new scientific domains that are not necessarily being pursued aggressively with public funding in the United States. China's S&T device approval process, surprisingly, is relatively bottom-up. It's scientist-led. They are allowed to propose ideas that then go to the National Development and Reform Commission, which is China's national economic planning agency. They have an office in Beijing for national lab and science facility infrastructure approval and development. They then have a 5-year plan, as I mentioned, that they use every 5 years to guide development, which is classified. And then they have the medium long-range plan as well that sets overall scientific domain investment targets. Once those ideas are circulated within the Chinese system, they establish an experts committee, an advisory committee, a feasibility study, and in some cases, they even invite international experts from different scientific societies and communities to join them in the planning process, in the feasibility process, as ultimately many of China's facilities will be civilian. They will be user open facilities, and they want the global scientific community to take part in many of their scientific programs to improve China's international standing and prestige, but also bring knowledge and insight that other scientific programs have been able to glean over the decades in their own research pathways. They want some of that knowledge as well to be applied to help optimize and accelerate China's own scientific development. Just to give you a sense of the type of examples that China is actively building today. I already mentioned the burning plasma fusion reactor that's being built outside of Hefei for tokamaks. China is building a large, high-intensity, heavy ion accelerator facility for studying transmutation of nuclear materials. They're building a national fusion stellarator lab that's going to exclusively focus on stellarator approach for nuclear fusion. This, for example, just to give you the sense of scale and pace of construction, the level of investment, this is China's heavy ion accelerator facility in Huizhou, which is in Guangdong province. The idea is to take nuclear materials from their nuclear power stations and using accelerators transmutate a lot of that waste back into useful nuclear fuel. And so this is actually a sort of parallel facility being built to 6 nuclear power stations that are being built concurrently along with the HIAF facility. And they cleared off a mountaintop, and this is now actually built out. I have another photo now that's being completed. But it just helps you understand the size and scale and the level of bold ambitions that China has in this space. Of course, I think many of you saw in January of this year, Reuters reported that China is building a large-scale national ignition facility for laser ignition, ICF, at their China Academy of Engineering Physics. It's likely about 4 times physical footprint of NIF, using a diode-based laser system, and they're aggressively building that. In fact, as soon as NIF announced net gain fusion, China kicked off and accelerated the construction of this facility very rapidly. In number of light sources and particle accelerators, for example, China right now is building about 6 to 9, depending on how you measure them, new light sources, synchrotron light sources, free electron lasers, soft X-ray lasers, and many of these are going to be working on cutting-edge materials science, materials engineering, biotechnology work. And they're also opening these facilities, I mentioned, to international collaborators, but they're also inviting their private sector. Many of the light stations, for example, are open to companies that are working on aerospace, battery innovation. In fact, China's building its own exclusive light source that'll just be for industrial usage and not for scientific research. And many different cities are building their own light sources, competing against each other. So obviously, there might be a bit of an overbuild problem that they may have to face down the road, but it's probably a better problem to have rather than not. This is an example of the Shenzhen superconducting soft X-ray free electron laser that's being built in Shenzhen. It skims across mountaintops. They're right now actively building this facility. The Dongguang attosecond laser, the Shanghai high repetition rate, hard X-ray free electron laser, a number of new ultra intense pulse lasers. And, if you think about all the innovation that China is putting in here, coupled with their existing world-class effort into material science, discovery, and innovation, I think material science is an area to watch China very closely for, as these facilities will really allow China to push new frontiers of material science, discovery, and innovation. Of course, you may have heard about China's plans to build their own CERN, known as the Circular Electron Position Collider at 100 kilometers circumference. The most recent news, however, coming out from China is that this facility, which has been on sort of the docket for approval in China, may not be approved over the next 5 years. It is likely, even for China, a bit more ambitious, or at least within the government, some of the reporting has been that they're uncertain as to the actual utility of something like this. Now, that's not to say, though, that we should sort of rest easy. As I mentioned, China's building 9 other light sources and particle accelerators. And I think that's an assessment by China that more is better than one large facility in terms of these type of investments. Another example is this city block size hypergravity research center known as CHIEF outside of Hangzhou. This is where they're working to simulate different materials and extreme physical conditions under intense gravitational stress, whether it's outer space, undersea, so they can work on really advanced engineering problems where they have to sort of push the limits of gravitational stress on those systems. Obviously, it's going to be of utility to China's manned space program, but also for a lot of their undersea exploration efforts that they're making. In quantum and precision measurement, for example, China has built a national quantum computing lab, but they're also building a national quantum and precision measurement lab. Just shows, and there's multiple labs being built for multiple subdomains, for example, in this space of quantum. As a result, what we're seeing is these big investments are driving also talent to at least participate in on a short term, but increasingly on a longer term basis in China's scientific programs. In fact, this is a study on the left from Stanford University that found since 2018, there's actually been a significant increase in not only heritage Chinese scientists, but also non-heritage Chinese scientists in domains like engineering, computer science, mathematics, material science, life sciences, that for various different reasons, whether it's the geopolitical tensions, whether it's funding constraints, but on the China side, the bold nature of China's funding really provides an opportunity for postdocs or assistant professors who may not have the opportunity to expand or grow their career as rapidly in the United States, and they're seeking to take advantage of those opportunities in China. And that includes now Nobel laureates, award-winning mathematicians who are drawn to the top-down embrace of science by the central government and the almost unchecked funding that's available at these labs at the local level, at the municipal level. And there's so much activity that someone who might have been an assistant professor at a U.S. university may have to wait a decade for tenure, will get tenure immediately, a whole lab, hundreds of people, and hundreds of millions of dollars of funding available to them right away if they're willing to move to cities that increasingly have a higher quality of life, particularly on China's East Coast, like Shanghai, Hangzhou, Shenzhen. Obviously, there's a number of drawbacks, and I'll talk about those a little bit later, that come with working inside the Chinese science and science technology ecosystem, particularly politics and meritocracy. But overall, when I talk to scientists who spent time in China, and both heritage and non-heritage Chinese scientists, there's a lot of excitement around the type of activity and the investments that China is making. And that's palpable, for example, last month when a dozen European scientific institutions announced in China they would collaborate with China on nuclear fusion research, as they're excited about the type of investments that China is making, and they want to be able to piggyback off a number of those facilities in, say, superconducting materials. One other aspect that I think is also critical to China's science technology advancement is their investment into supercomputing and AI. As increasingly we're going to be looking towards whether it's large language models or frontier AI systems to help accelerate scientific discovery, or at least act as a research assistant or a scientific assistant, and helping us solve some of the critical scientific problems facing humanity today. China treats their computing infrastructure as national science technology infrastructure. They have a series of nationally funded supercomputing centers. They have a national data center construction program known as the Eastern Data Western Compute Program. And they make a priority to ensure that scientific labs, researchers, and universities are not deprioritized when new data centers and AI supercomputers are being built. And they're going out of the way to ensure, for example, that commercial data centers that offer, say, accelerated AI services with GPUs offer a certain percentage of their time through vouchers to universities and China's national labs. And we all know that's been a challenge, as the money is in the big hyperscalers in Western countries. That's where the majority of the compute supply is going. And trying to get priority for universities and labs has been a challenge here in the US. Not so much in China, as they're making a concerted effort to try and balance out that compute supply availability. And as a result, partially due to the compute availability, but also because of the excitement in AI, China sees huge opportunity in what they call as AI for S, or AI for science. And while it's exciting that we had the Genesis mission launched here in the US, China for 2 years has been talking and funding multiple government institutes and labs to develop AI models trained on scientific data. And they've already done so for domains like computational fluid dynamics, earthquake prediction, aerospace design, biological science, some foundational models trained exceeding hundreds of billions of parameters. For example, there are two national labs in China that are relatively new. This is Pengcheng AI Labs in Shenzhen, partnering with Huawei. They, in partnership with Huawei, have developed a number of foundational multi-billion, hundreds of billion parameter models for astrophysics and geospatial data. Another national lab known as Zhejiang Lab, which is brand new outside of Hangzhou, has partnered with Alibaba. They have their own supercomputers, but they're also working with Alibaba, and they're developing large language models for astronomy and weather prediction. And they're even launching low Earth orbit satellites in space that have large language models that are processing telemetric data to reduce bandwidth and improve telemetric data precision. So this just gets you the sense of ambition down at the local lab level of embracing AI as a scientific accelerant. Now, I've spent the last 45 minutes talking about a lot of the opportunities and the big investments that China is making. Obviously, this is impressive by any means and any measurement, but there are challenges that China will face to become what they hope is going to be the world's preeminent science technology superpower. I believe those challenges are twofold. One is in political ideology, and the second is funding related. While ironically, China believes hardening the political ideology of their scientists is an advantage, my perspective is that it will likely be a constraint on some forms of Chinese innovation and discovery. And at the minimum, it's going to be a significant amount of time that lab leadership, lab bureaucracy management, and leading scientists are going to have to spend on political indoctrination, political training classes, taking tests and qualifications every year. And increasingly, the party, not the civilian scientists cadre, is in leading university positions. University presidents now are largely going to party members, not civilian administrators. And this just means that overall, for example, on the left, this is an image of a lecture that every scientist in a leading position had to attend in Shanghai earlier this year to understand Xi Jinping's guidance on science technology for the party. Or this is a training camp that Chinese nuclear fusion scientists had to attend to learn how to be a better party member and better be attuned to the directives of Xi Jinping. What's unique is the directives here that Xi have given are very mission oriented. In fact, the guidance that he's given scientists in sort of Chinese way have a slogan, and that slogan is that Chinese scientists should walk with 2 feet in 2 different directions and be facing 4 different missions for science technology. Those 2 directions they have to walk in is that they said 1 foot has to walk the trail of global scientific discovery, and the other foot has to walk the trail of national rejuvenation and the objectives of the party. And the 4 facings they talk about is face the party, face the nation, face the frontier of science, and face the livelihood of people. And so now scientists have to repackage their projects, have to work them through the system in terms of budget allocation and approval to ensure that they're meeting those party objectives. On the other hand, one other challenge that China will face is as their economy has slowed from really breakneck pace development over the last 2 decades, from say 10% compound growth of their GDP to now estimates around 1 or 2% growth. It does mean that China will have to make some trade-offs, and they will have some budget constraints. Now, China's economy has grown to become the 2nd largest in the world, and so they have a much larger budgetary expanse available to them. And as China has made science technology funding a top priority, I don't believe in the next 5 years we're going to see a significant reduction in their investments. It does mean, though, that even China, for the country of its size, they will have to make some choices and trade-offs as to what they invest and what they prioritize. So overall, just moving to the conclusion before we go into the Q&A session, my perspective from looking at the activity on the ground, talking to scientists, reading China's plans and objectives, it's very clear that China has an overt ambition to push towards the frontier of scientific discovery. It is very envious of the success that the United States has achieved through its own era of big science, developing national labs and science and technology infrastructure, and it's replicating it, although placing some Chinese characteristics on top of it, like stronger emphasis on a more top-down plan system than, say, the U.S. ecosystem, and more emphasis on state-owned enterprises than private enterprise. But bottom line, I think we need to be understanding that China will, with these investments over the next 5 and 10 years, will start to see a significant payoff in its research output, research quality, and research contributions to global scientific discovery. And China will no longer be imitating, but rather be pioneering new scientific discoveries, moving into new scientific domains that may not even be available to us in the United States and the West because of the more modern advanced facilities that China will have at their disposal. And then if you factor in China's whole of nation embrace of AI, particularly for scientific discovery, that's likely going to be another accelerant that'll help improve China's scientific output. So I'm, again, really happy to be here today speaking to an audience that likely very clearly understands the importance of science, but I thought it would be helpful to highlight also how China is viewing science within its national strategy. So with that, that concludes the formal part of my presentation, and I look forward to the Q&A.